Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Proverbs chapter 2 in our continuing study of the book of Proverbs. Our outline of the book so far, remember we gave you a complete outline, and we're in this first section, chapters 1 through 9, where there's an appeal to wisdom and 10 speeches. We've looked at the first two in the previous chapter. We had the warning against following sinners, chapter 1, verses 8 through 19. Actually, the first 7 verses was sort of an introduction. Then there was a call to wisdom. Wisdom was out calling in the streets, verses 20 through 33. Now we come to the calling out to wisdom. Sounds a little bit like what we just talked about in verses 20 through 23 through 33. We'll see that in a second. And then finally, there's going to be the results of wisdom. But notice what I just said. There seems to be a connection between the call to wisdom, the call of wisdom, and the calling out to wisdom. There's a calling and a calling. And likewise, I think maybe there's a connection. We're going to see this in a bit. The warning against following sinners versus the results of wisdom that we'll see at the end, the latter part of this chapter. Let's jump in. This is the call to wisdom. My son, and we've seen that. In fact, when we see my son, look to see if that's a transition to a new section. Very often, regularly, it is. And it is here. My son, if you will receive my words and treasure my commandments within you. So receiving, treasuring, that's the same thing. Words, commandments, that's the same thing. Make your ear attentive to wisdom, incline your heart to understanding. I want you to catch the parallelism that's taking place here. For if you cry for discernment, lift your voice for understanding. If you seek her, and notice wisdom, remember, is female. We said that all nouns in Hebrew are either masculine or feminine, and wisdom, chachma, just happens to be a feminine word. If you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, if you do that, notice there's an if clause. If you receive my words, if you cry for wisdom, if you seek for her as silver, search for her as for hidden treasures, then verse 5 is the conclusion. Then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. And so remember, the fear of the Lord, that's sort of the big idea. That's the first step in this whole quest. And that leads to the knowledge of God. And so do you want to have that right relationship with God? Do you want to know him? Proverbs is giving you a path to get there. For the Lord gives wisdom. And remember that, again, that's the tetragrammaton, the name of God that's being used. The Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. It's understood here. He is a shield to those. Remember, it's italicized, so that's telling us the translators added that. But God is still being described there as a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the path of justice, and he preserves the way of his godly ones. If you do that, then you will discern righteousness and justice. So here's the then clause. If you do these things, we had one result. You'll discern righteousness and justice and equity and every good course. For wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will guard you, and understanding will watch over you. These are the results of following this call to wisdom, of heeding the call. Now, I want to give you an overall. We're going to go back to chapter 1 again, and I want you to see how these first two chapters actually form a complete unit. There was the invitation to sinners. That was after the introduction in verses 1 through 7. The invitation to sinners. Don't listen to that invitation, you were told. That was the warning. And then their way is evil. They hasten to do evil, and their end is death. And we saw that in the previous chapter. Then the second section was the call to wisdom, where you were called, hear the call to wisdom as she's calling in the streets. She raises her voice. She calls. Those who reject her will seek and not find her. And the foolish don't choose the fear of the Lord. That was verses 20 through 33. Now, as we're reading in chapter 2, we have this call out to wisdom. And you're told, call and raise your voice to her and seek wisdom that you may find the knowledge of God. The wise will understand the fear of the Lord. Now, notice how this section you had in verse chapter, the end of chapter 1, wisdom raises her voice and calls. Here, you're told, raise your voice to her. Back then, we saw they will seek and not find her. You're told, seek wisdom that you may find the knowledge of God. Back in chapter 1, the foolish do not choose the fear of the Lord. But here we see the wise will understand the fear of the Lord. So I want you to see how the latter section of chapter 1 and this first section that we've just gone through, chapters 2, verses 1 through 11, form a unit. But we're not finished. We're going to wrap the whole thing up in what we're about to see in chapter 2, verses 12 through 22. There'll be an invitation to sinners about how wisdom will protect you, and the warning about sinners: their way is evil, they delight to do evil, their end is death. Do you see the connection where back in the beginning of chapter 1, verses 8 through 19, we saw that sinners, their way is evil, they hasten to do evil, their end is death. Now we see essentially, close to word for word, the same thing. Their way is evil, they delight to do evil, their end is death. Let's look at it now. So the results of wisdom: to deliver you from the way of evil. And so wisdom is, by following wisdom, you're going to find deliverance. Now, the term there, to deliver you, the le katsilka. The term le, usually we see to or for. And the only reason I underscore it here is because we're going to see it again, but it might not be translated quite that way. So, to deliver you from the way of evil. And notice, from the way of evil, from those who leave the paths of uprightness, to walk in the ways of darkness. So the way of evil, the paths of they're leaving the bad paths, or the good paths, to walk in the ways of darkness. Who delight in doing evil. Notice, they delight in it. They rejoice in the perversity of evil. Whose paths are crooked, and who are devious in their ways. So notice the way, the paths, and now at the end, the paths, the ways. Sort of, we're supposed to see the parallelism and the repetition that is being presented. Continuing with the results of wisdom, to deliver you, and here again we have lekatsilka, but again, to deliver you. I'm only emphasizing this because we're going to see it one more time where it won't be translated that way. To deliver you from the strange woman. Who's the strange woman? What's a strange woman? Well, here it explains it in the next line: from the adulteress who flatters with her words. And folks need to be delivered from that sort of situation. Notice that and then it further describes her, that leaves the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. And I said in a previous class that Proverbs isn't going to talk a lot about covenants, but here's a term that references the covenant of marriage. She leaves the companion of youth. It indicates, she's been married a long time, but now she forgets that covenant. Notice the covenant's just not made with her spouse, but it's made with God. Verse 18, for her house sinks down to death, and her tracks lead down. The word death there, mavet. Moth is the regular word for death, but her tracks lead down to the dead. Here we have a different term, rephaim. Notice it's plural. The im is plural, masculine plural. The dead ones, or the corpses, maybe is a better rendition. So it's two different words to describe essentially the same thing. Her following the strange woman, the adulteress, is not a good way to go. It's not a way that leads to life and prosperity. Just the opposite. Verse 19: none who go down to her return again. Another way of saying that, nor do they reach the paths of life. Her path is a way that leads to death. Finally, verse 20, so you will walk, but this time we have, again, that same lema. This time it's lema'an telek, but notice that le prefix, in order to make you walk, if I wanted to be consistent with our translation in the past few verses, to make you walk in the way of good men. Notice, in the way of good men, to keep to the paths of the righteous. So good men, righteous, that's saying the same thing. The way, the paths, that's saying the same thing. Verse 21, for the upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be uprooted from it. So you see the upright and blameless describing the same individual. The wicked and the treacherous, two different ways of describing the same individual. Notice what happens in each case. The upright live in the land, the blameless remain in it. By contrast, the wicked are cut off from the land, the treacherous are uprooted from it. So as we come to the conclusion, I want you to notice there have been 22 verses in this chapter. Now, it just so happens to be that there's also 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Now, I would normally look at that and say, well, that's maybe just a coincidence that you have that many verses. Except that when we get to the end of the book of Proverbs, the very last chapter will actually be an acrostic taking each of those 22 letters and lining them up in order, in alphabetical order, with those last 22 verses. And that makes me think that maybe here at the beginning of Proverbs, we have a little something similar going on, although the alphabet isn't used where each letter begins with a corresponding letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's not that. It's not like what we're going to have at the end. But still, there's enough of a pattern to make me suggest that there might be a little relationship between this chapter and the very last. If I can say it this way, that I have from here to the end of the book, the A to Z, or as the New Testament Greek would say it, the Alpha and Omega. And remember that in the New Testament, we find out that Jesus is our Alpha, our Omega. He is the beginning and end. He is the be-all of our life, of our walk, of our relationship with God. He is ours.